Story 1. So this happened around 2008. My buddy Brock had gotten out of the military after 10 years. He'd started in the Marines but transitioned into the Army for the last 4 years before buying a house in Texas. When he got out, he did a variety of jobs before landing a gig with a repo service. He worked there for a year and had a lot of wild stories, but this one sticks out the most as he helped a fellow soldier get revenge on an evil ex. Brock was at the office speaking with his manager, whom I'll refer to as Karen. Now, this particular Karen had a lot of Karen-like qualities, but was a force for good if you can believe that. While they were talking, they see a young man enter the office. They immediately noticed he had 2 black eyes and an arm was in a sling. The young man, whose name I unfortunately never learned, but I'll call Ben, asked how hard it would be for them to help repossess his car. Karen called her daughter in, Karen Jr., and had her pour Ben a cup of coffee. Karen then asked Ben to tell her a story. Ben began with telling her that he had just returned from a deployment. He had been dating a local girl that lived outside of the famous Fort Hood. Not a good idea, BTW, before the deployment. Thanks to a previous deployment, he had managed to get himself a used black Dodge Charger, which was his baby. He further explained that shortly after buying the car he had met the local girl, who for the sake of the story I'll call Morgan. Morgan was always asking to drive his car, but he would always decline. When he was getting ready for his deployment, Morgan repeatedly asked if she could borrow the car, but he kept saying no. After much needling, he relented, but on the condition that she take care of his apartment until he comes back from rest and relaxation leave. She agreed. Ben left for his deployment while Morgan took care of his place. When Ben came back for leave, he found his apartment immaculate. He pulled his car from storage, drove to Morgan's. He spent a few days with her before handing her the keys and heading to his home state to visit family before returning to his deployment. He returned again from his deployment and found nothing but trouble. When he walked into his apartment, he found a layer of dust on just about every surface. It was almost like no one had been there in months. When he checked his bedroom, he'd found his room had been torn apart. All of his drawers had been searched and upturned. He tried to call Morgan, but never received an answer. He located his safe, which was hidden, and found it hadn't been touched. He then grabbed his spare key from the safe, called a buddy of his, and they went to Morgan's. As they pulled up to Morgan's, he saw a car there that he initially didn't recognize, but as they got closer, he realized it was his baby. Morgan had the car painted hot pink and put 24-inch spinners on it. He tried the key just to make sure, and the lights flickered as it unlocked. While his buddy laughed, Ben went to the front door and Morgan answered. He asked what happened to his car, and she responded, "It's my car now." Ben walked away and hopped in his hot pink mess. As he started it, 4 large dudes came out of Morgan's house, one with a baseball bat, and yanked Ben out of his car. They proceeded to beat the crap out of him in the driveway before his friend intervened, pulling his conceal and carry pistol on the group. He then took Ben to the hospital. I'm honestly not sure if the cops were called on this. I'd assume yes, but even then Ben said his friend drove by Morgan's house a handful of times while he was in the hospital at random times, and the car was never there. Karen stared at Ben for a bit before asking for the paperwork. Ben handed it to her, and Karen had a smile on her face. She then asked Ben for Morgan's phone number. Ben gave it but wasn't aware of what was about to happen. Karen handed the phone to Karen Jr., who then dialed the number. Karen Jr. then began speaking to Morgan, telling her that they'd met at one of the local clubs and wanted to know if she was down to party that night. Apparently Morgan agreed and the plan was set. Brock parked his tow truck at the club and waited. Sure enough, Morgan showed up with a pink monster, parked it, and went inside with some girlfriends. Brock gave them 5 minutes before he stealthily drove up to the car and hooked it up. As he was pulling out with the pink monster, Morgan walked out of the club. She saw her car in the tow truck and began trying to flag Brock down, but he was already out of there. The next day it was business as usual at the office when Morgan called. She was furious that her car was stolen by them and wanted it back. Karen, using her best customer service voice, told her if she had the registration she could come pick it up. Morgan began screaming louder that she was going to call the cops, at which point Karen sarcastically told her, "Please do," then hung up on her. As this phone call was going on, Brock happened to look out the window and saw Morgan standing next to a car in a vacant lot, throwing what appeared to be a temper tantrum. After Karen hung up, Brock watched her get in the car on the passenger side. Karen then looked out the window and had Brock verify it was her. She then began to smirk. Karen then proceeded to call the owner of the property Morgan and her friend were occupying. She told the owner about the car and asked if he wanted it towed. The owner opted. Brock then drove his truck over to the ladies in the car and introduced himself. They tried to explain that they were waiting for Morgan's boyfriend, but Brock insisted they weren't allowed to park there. They argued and called him every name in the book. Brock then hooked up their car and lifted it partially off the ground, forcing the two to exit the vehicle. They tore into him until he showed them the tow order. While this back and forth was going on, Ben arrived at the office and Morgan saw him walk in. She ran to the office door and Brock proceeded to lower the car. When Brock went back to the office, all hell had broken loose. Morgan apparently tried to snag the keys back from Ben, but he pocketed them. She began to hit him in his hurt arm and warned Ben that she'd call her friends to finish the job if she didn't get her keys back. Karen Jr. had already called the cops at this point, and Brock got in between Ben and Morgan, even telling Morgan to try hitting him to find out what would happen. Morgan then tried to play the pity card and said she only wanted the keys to get her laptop out for school. Karen asked Ben to hand the keys over to Brock so he could grab the laptop. Brock retrieved the laptop from the car, and as he was handing it over, she rushed to aggressively grab it, but knocked it from Brock's hands. Completely furious at this point, Morgan accused Brock of dropping the computer on purpose and threatened to sue. The cops then arrived and Morgan began her sob story again, telling the police that they stole her car. The police questioned Karen and Karen gave her casual smirk while asking if they wanted to see the security videos. The police watched and listened as Morgan punched Ben several times and heard the threats she made about sending her friends after him. The police then turned to Morgan, who had turned ghost white at this point. She tried to back her way to the door, but the police stopped her. They proceeded to ask about the car, Ben's injuries, and who she planned on sending after him. She initially denied everything, but they already had evidence of her beating him up. She was arrested and Ben got his car back. After the cops left, Ben admitted he didn't want to be seen in a car that looked like it was advertising Pepto-Bismol and planned on trading it in for a GTO. We later heard through the grapevine that the 4 guys who beat up Ben were arrested. Morgan had ratted them out. Story 2. Hello, everyone. I want to tell you a crazy story that happened to me not long ago. It's about a cocky guy who thought he could just walk in and take my favorite old truck. That day, he messed with the wrong guy. Hold on tight, because this one's a doozy. In the morning, I was sitting on my porch with a cup of piping hot coffee and looking at my favorite thing in the world, a 1950 Ford F-100 pickup truck. As you can see, that truck has been in my family for many years. It was an important piece of history, and I had carefully brought it back to its former glory. It turned a lot of heads, and I was happy to own it. I heard tires screeching to a stop while I was lost in thought and enjoying the peace and quiet of the moment. When I turned around, I saw a fancy sports car parked right in front of my house. A man who looked like he was straight out of a fashion magazine walked out of the driver's side door. He wore brand clothes from head to toe, and his expensive sunglasses seemed to protect his eyes from the sun. I heard him strut toward me with a cocky grin and say, "Hey, buddy." When he came up to me, I couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Can I help you with something?" With a nice tone, I asked. He leaned against the porch fence and looked at my old truck without any real interest. He said, "Nice ride you got there," but his tone was full of snobbery. I nodded, trying to be polite even though he was being rude. "Thank you. It comes from my family. Has been in my family for many years." He laughed, as if my emotional connection to the truck were a joke. He began, "Well, here's the deal. I promised a friend who really likes these old cars that I'd get him one. What amount of money do you want for this old thing? I was shocked by how bold he was. I told them, sorry, but this truck is not for sale. It's priceless to me. He didn't seem to care about what I said. Hey, everything costs something. We can make a deal if you tell me the price. I shook my head, getting more and more annoyed by his insistence. I told you it wasn't for sale. Now, please leave my land. The cocky guy's smile went away, and his eyes got narrow. Do you not get it? I get what I want every time. You're just a country bumpkin who doesn't value what they have. I made fists and tried not to lose my anger. I suggest you get back in your car and leave before I call the police. Getting angry, he sighed and said something under his breath. He walked back to his flashy car on his heel and drove off in a huff, leaving a trail of burning rubber on the road. I thought that was the end of it, but I had no idea that this cocky guy would not give up easy. After a few days, things went back to normal. As I kept working on my truck, I would sometimes take it for a drive around town. It was my getaway and a link to the past, and I loved every minute I spent with it. Then, one night as the sun was going down, I saw something strange out my living room window. He was back, that cocky guy, sneaking around my truck like a thief at night. As I watched him try to jimmy open the door, my heart was beating fast. A rush of energy ran through my body as I ran outside. Hey, what do you think you're doing? I yelled, and my voice was shaking with anger. He fell off the truck while holding a crowbar because he was scared. He said, "Oh, I was just admiring your antique," acting like he wasn't guilty. I didn't believe it for a second. It looks like you want to steal it. His haughtiness showed up again in the form of a smile. Hey, honey, I'm just a car fanatic. I was scared to death, but I knew I had to keep my cool. I already told you that it's not for sale. Stop being on my land now. After he thought about it for a moment, he threw the crowbar away and put on his expensive clothes in a show. Okay, have it your way. But I'll be back, and I'll take that truck then. After that, he walked back to his sports car and sped off, making me very angry and frustrated. I knew I couldn't let this cocky guy steal my truck and get away with it, so I did something about it myself. It was the next morning when I went to the police office to report the attempted theft. The police were understanding and said they would keep an eye out for anything fishy. They told me to put up security cameras around my house, which I did right away. As the days turned into weeks, I began to feel better because I believed the spoiled brat had finally given up. But just when I was less alert, he attacked again, this time with even more bravado. I heard a noise coming from my driveway one night. He was trying to pull my truck with his own huge tow truck, which made me rush to the window. I couldn't believe this guy had nerve. My angry heart was beating fast as I stormed out of the house. What the hell do you think you're doing? I screamed at him. He turned around to face me, and his smug look didn't change. I told you I'd be back for this truck, and I always keep my promises. I was done being nice to this spoiled brat. With my eyes fixed on him, I quickly pulled out my phone and called 911. I'm calling the police now. This is not acceptable. He went from being cocky to being scared, and he quickly separated the tow truck from my antique. He said in a low voice, "You're making a big mistake," and then he drove off. In the hopes that they would be able to catch him this time, I told the cops about the man and his flashy car. They told me to stay safe and said they'd do their best. As I watched the cocky guy speed off again, I couldn't help but feel scared. He made it clear that he wouldn't stop until he got my truck, so I had to do something to protect my valuable family treasure. So, I chose to talk to a neighborhood security expert and make my property safer. We put in extra security cams, motion-activated lights, and stronger locks. For the arrogant guy to get near my truck again, I was going to do everything I could to stop him. The guy who seemed to be spoiled seemed to have disappeared after a few weeks. Another time, I let down my guard because I hoped he had given up for good, but I knew in my heart that he was just biding his time. waiting for the right time to strike again. From my yard, I heard a loud crash one night. I rushed to the window and felt sick to my stomach as I saw the cocky guy repeatedly ramming his sports car into my old truck. I was shocked. He broke it right in front of my eyes. My anger was so strong that I ran out into the rain and yelled at him, "What the hell is wrong with you?" His face was twisted with rage as he kept ramming his car into my truck. He yelled back, "You should have sold it to me when you had the chance." I had to stop him before he did more damage. I knew. I begged my neighbor to call the cops as I ran to their house and banged on the door. As you could hear the sirens far away, the spoiled brat finally moved away from my damaged truck and sped off into the wet night. When the cops arrived, they saw how badly my old truck was damaged and went on the hunt for the spoiled brat right away. I was scared of what he might do next because it was clear he had truly lost it. There were no signs of the spoiled guy for weeks, and then I got a call from the cops with some shocking news. The police officer on the other end of the line said, "We found the guy who's been bothering you. He's been involved in a number of thefts and damage to property. We have arrested him." My heart felt lighter as I ran to the police station. When I got there, I saw the cocky guy handcuffed and sitting in a holding cell. He had lost his cocky attitude and was looking defeated. The spoiled brat was charged with a bunch of different crimes, including attempted theft and damage to property. The end result was that my old truck stayed where it belonged, with me. The guy who thought he was entitled enough to get my truck against my will ended up spending a long time in prison for his deeds. Story 3. Backstory. In WW2, my Uncle Hadj was an engineer with the RAF. He rapidly climbed the ranks and ended up being the head engineer at a local base. After the war, he met his wife of 45 years, Eve. It was the typical post-war relationship, without children though due to complications. He quickly found a job at our village coal mine, known locally as the Pit. He went from engineer to foreman very quickly. The man had a knack for leadership, that's for sure. He and Eve, some of his RAF buddies, and his sister, my grandmother, often went to Spain for holidays, at least once before they all retired. After that, whenever they felt like it. The family. The unfortunate truth is that family isn't always nice. My grandmother was his only surviving direct family. Eve, on the other hand, had a large family. Very large. The trouble with large families is that often there's a few bad eggs. In this case, it was quicker to count the good ones, as Hadj would put it. The trouble with eggs is, you can only tell the good ones by spinning them quick, or dunking them in water. I don't fancy going to prison. More often than not, Eve's family would drop by and ask to borrow money. Not from Eve, she had none. Hadj had always been industrious, saving as much as he could and only really spending what he had to, other than the holidays of course. The incident. When I hit 18 legal drinking age in the UK, he took me for my first beer, as my dad worked nights and had to sleep. He didn't drink, which was uncommon for him, as he was a regular at the working men's club we were in. Me. "Hadj, how come you're not drinking? I can't in good conscience drink your money without you getting a sniff." Hadj. "Well, I suppose one can't hurt. Don't tell Nip his name for my grandmother, Sheila, but I've just been diagnosed with diabetes type 2. Don't want to take any chances." Me. "I'll keep your secret, but you need to tell her, just on the off chance." Hadj. "I'll tell her in good time, kiddo. Now get it down you before it goes flat." Neither of us took much notice of the people around us, so we didn't notice Eve's nephew in the corner. 5 years pass. I've seen him a few times less than I'd like because of work and him going overseas. The build-up. I visited my grandparents one day to find my grandmother sobbing, with Hadj sitting on the sofa. "Hadj, put the kettle on, kid. I need to tell you something. I make a coffee for Gran and Granddad. Hot chocolate for me and green tea for Hadj." Hadj. "Now listen up. I've not got long on this wretched planet, but you're not to cry over me. I've been diagnosed with late-stage cancer, and couldn't be happier to be leaving. To Gran, sorry Nip, I know you don't want to hear this, but it has to be said. You and yours will be looked after, of course, but you're not to tell Eve and her family. To everyone, I've made up a new will. I want everyone to go to the reading. I've prepared a little gift for the family. Shortly after this chat, we found out he passed away. We kept it from my grandmother that he'd taken his own life. It'd destroy her. Let it be said that Hodge was always a man independent of others. He made his choice so Gran wouldn't suffer seeing him deteriorate over time. The revenge. We went to the reading as a family like he asked. It's the only thing he ever asked of us. We'd seen people we never met, never even heard of, so of course, there were some sullen scowls across the table. Lawyer. Now that we're all here, please watch this video. Hadge has a message for you all. Hadge from beyond. Now then, I imagine this will be a shock to most of you, but I had cancer. If you're watching this, I want you to know that some of you made my last few years pleasant. Others? Well, we'll get to you. To my side of the family, not one of you came to me asking if I was all right or wanted anything to do. Instead, you asked if I wanted a hand with anything. For this, I thank you. I've never had anyone do anything for me unless they were my underlings in the RAF, and I didn't aim to start when I found out I was on my way out. You knew me better than most of my close family. I'll tell you if something's wrong. Good on you. Now then, let's get to the good bit. To Eve's family, you lot, where do I begin? When I took our Nip's grandson out for his first pint, apparently the walls have ears, and one of you overheard me tell him I had diabetes. Shame you had to say it's a shame it wasn't cancer. Guess you got your wish, eh? The rest of you. Whenever you visited me, you asked more often than not if you could borrow money. It's fine, I didn't mind lending it to you, but I did expect to get it back. So, here's how this is going to work. I've split my money and put it in trust with my oldest friend, the lawyer. Nobody is getting a thing till Eve pops her clogs, so don't bother asking. Eve can stay in the house I worked hard for until she either dies or has to go into care for any reason. The house is not to be sold until after she dies. Lazy as she is, she's still my wife. Once she dies, the house is to be sold at a reasonable price to the next owners, and the money from that is to be added to the total for my finances and split with the family. Eve's is her own, and she can do with it what she wants, other than add it to my total. Lawyer has been left instructions on this. Now, here's how it'll be split. If you've borrowed money from me and paid it back, you'll get a fair share based on your age at the time of my death. If you haven't repaid the money you borrowed, you'll still get a cut, minus what you owe me. For some of you, I hope you know I'm laughing at your squirming from beyond the grave. Serves you right. Nip, my only living family, you'll get the lion's share of whatever is there, to be done with what you will. If you're not wanting to keep it, lawyer has been paid for any services you may require. Trust him, he's a good lad and saved me on more than one occasion in the war. Nip's sons will get a decent chunk to help with whatever you need, and your children will be provided for as well. To my mum, not once have I heard anything bad about you. You're getting a cut too, like it or lump it. Op, you've been a great help the last couple of weeks. I called you unfairly at 3 a.m. to help me out of the bath after finally giving up getting myself out. Sorry you had to see that. You didn't have to help the next day with the decorating either. If you weren't already on your career path, you'd make a fine tradesman. You will receive a cut to be determined by the near future's events. Use it how you will. To the rest of you, I'm utterly disgusted to have known you. I mentioned earlier that Eve can live in the house till she dies or is put into residential care. If either of these happens, nobody is to live in the house. I don't want anyone I don't trust in there. Now quit your crying and go about your lives, Hadge. As you can imagine, people kicked up a stink about this. We nodded to the lawyer and left. Shortly after the funeral, Eve went into a retirement home with her own money. Hadge was locked up as per his request. She had more than enough to keep her afloat for many more years. A couple of months down the line, we all got called back to the lawyer's office, a little bemused. Again, we're directed to watch a video. Hadge, I'm not surprised that this video has been played. Some of you just don't follow orders. If you're watching this, it means that someone I don't trust was found to be living in my house. I don't care who it is. Lawyer has instructions of what to do next. But for the sake of his voice and sanity, whoever was found in the house against my wishes is now stricken from the will entirely. If the others feel they want to share their money with you, that's their loss. You'll not get a penny from me. As it turns out, my cousin who bullied me in school and her family, as in her on and off boyfriend, 2 kids and a dog, had moved into the house after convincing Eve to move out because they needed the house. What they hadn't counted on is nosy neighbors. Hadge asked them to watch the house, and if they saw anyone new in there or any signs of moving, to report to the lawyer for updates. In return, they'd get a cut of the money he had. They're good people. The lesson? Don't screw with a war vet. Story 4. About a year ago, I decided to move out on my own for good since living with others caused me ongoing stress. The only way to secure a place quickly was to take a unit on the edge of a less than ideal district in town. Since there was a police station literally across the road, I figured I'd be safe. Needless to say, I don't live there anymore. Initially, everything seemed fine. I moved in, started learning how to cook more complex dishes beyond chicken soup. It was all going well. Most people in my row of units kept to themselves. Aside from my neighbor on one side having noisy late-night activities, everyone else left me alone. Except for one man. He was in the unit next to me, and he was, in hindsight, way too enthusiastic about having a single lady moving in next door. He constantly came over just to say hi and see how I was settling in, often requiring a firm nudge to leave. He frequently smelled of alcohol and took advantage of the summer weather and locked windows. Yes, the place had sealed windows without keys to wander in when I was working. He was annoying but seemed relatively harmless. The first sign that something more concerning was happening came when the police arrived, attempting to serve a warrant on him. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, insisting they were looking for the previous tenant and that he hadn't answered because he was asleep. In hindsight, I was rather naive to believe him, especially since I'm a heavy sleeper, and their knock woke me up. Then he asked if he could use my computer to check his email because his was supposedly in the shop. I let him, hoping it would keep him occupied and out of my hair. I didn't think much of it until one night, when he and the man from the other unit came over after having a few drinks, wanting to watch a show. The other guy was friendly, even in his tipsy state. But things took a dark turn when my neighbor made a disturbing joke about harming the other man. I told him to leave, and as he left, I overheard him mutter, "I'm not joking." The next day, I spoke to the other man and learned that the neighbor's computer had recently been confiscated by the police. Shortly after, the neighbor disappeared for a month. Real estate agents started asking me if I knew where he was and why he hadn't been paying rent. Eventually, he returned, paid his outstanding rent, and boasted about being jailed for having too many parking tickets. I'm no expert, but I know you don't get a month in jail over tickets. I tried to brush it off until I got extremely sick with the stomach flu, feeling miserable and sleep-deprived for a week. One night, the neighbor showed up at 11 p.m., demanding to be let in. Exhausted and frustrated, I finally snapped and told him to go away. The next day, I discovered the seat and tires of my motorcycle had been slashed. Even though both the police and I knew he was likely responsible, without evidence, there was nothing they could do. It was time for a little payback. I let him use my computer again, knowing he often forgot to log out of his email. Instead of signing him out, I called an old friend from school who is now a police officer. After explaining the situation, my friend told me to stay logged in. He'd be right over. A couple of hours later, my computer was being examined by a police department technician, who downloaded nearly everything the neighbor had written. I didn't see much, but what I did glimpse was deeply disturbing. After giving my statements to the police, I found out that the neighbor hadn't been jailed over parking tickets. He had been in trouble for allegedly drugging and attempting to assault someone in a local bar, and was only out on bail because his mother had posted it. Additionally, he was a registered offender. He had apparently lied to the real estate agents, who would have otherwise denied his rental application. The neighbor was arrested again for another offense they'd struggled to tie him to until finding the emails. I was subpoenaed as a witness, and he awaited trial. Just to make matters worse for him, my police friend informed the real estate agents about his record, leading to his eviction. Last week, I saw him in court, where he realized I was the one who had finally provided the police with the evidence needed to prosecute him. His reaction was one of shock and anger, but I had the satisfaction of watching him get sentenced to 10 years. Story 5. It was the mid-90s. My father was a highly paid business consultant. The company he worked for would hire him out to businesses who were trying to get off the ground. He would fly out, spend a few weeks with them, and train their management the finer points of business ownership. He also handled large projects, such as the planning, building, staffing, and organization of new offices, and other such. For this, his company would charge anywhere from $300 to $400 an hour for his time, billed by the week at a minimum of 40 hours a week or more if there was overtime. In exchange for this less than modest sum, the company took care of all of my father's expenses, rather than push them off on the client. This went on for years. My mom quit her job to stay at home with me, and my dad held down the finances of the household himself. But he was gone for 3 weeks at a time, and when he was here, he was at the office. I was lucky if I spent any real time with him more than 2 days a month. This also negatively affected my parents' marriage. Then, for my 6th birthday, my dad got me a model plane and a membership card to the airline his company used. In truth, it was a copy of his card, but 6-year-old me thought it was the coolest thing ever. It had my dad's name on it, and the word Admiral. Bringing his concerns regarding his home life to his boss, my father had struck a deal. I would be flown out to him every third or so weekend. My father would pay the cost of the flights, but would use his company account, and thus have access to his frequent flyer discount, company discount, and would collect any loyalty points or whatever that I earned. I was flying for pennies on the dollar. I would spend the weekend with him in whatever hotel we were in, and we would go and do stuff in the city. He got to see me, I got to see both him and a new city, and Mom got to spend a weekend without me to decompress. Everyone loved the arrangement, myself especially. Fast forward a year. I have achieved Admiral status within the airline's loyalty program, not a hard task as my dad already had that status and I was using his account, but I felt accomplished nonetheless, and have been to all 48 continental states. This is when something happened. There was a change in the company. People moved around, people were hired, and people were fired. And when all the dust settled, my dad found himself one position higher, and under new management. Dad's new manager had no issues with the father and son getaway perk my dad was liberally using. But to offset the extra cost, there would be a few changes to my dad's expense account. While food and entertainment were fully covered as many of his meetings happened over lunch, the manager decided that rather than provide my father with a rental car, instead he would take local transport, via cabs or similar services, and would be given a limited number of trips he could take a day. Surely he only needed to travel twice a day, to and from the site, so he was allotted 2 cab rides per day when he was out of state, including weekends, since the manager wanted to be generous. Any additional travel my father wanted to take would be on his own dime. My dad brought up that the company was not spending any resources on my trips, aside from the 30 minutes of time it took the travel agent to book my flights. But this new manager insisted that this was a much better use of company time and resources. All other expenses, including the hotel, dry cleaning, and any mail that had to be sent, would be covered as usual. Now, normally my visiting weekends would be jam-packed with whatever local museum or attraction the city had, followed by a nice dinner at a cool or fancy restaurant. One does not achieve this with 2 cab rides a day. My dad blows all his cab rides on my next visit. We go and see everything. A museum, a movie, an affair of some sort. Every trip was by cab. This is the part I remember, because my dad had me keep count with him. An entire amazing day was spent, and in total, 11 cab rides were had. Now for the malicious compliance. Without any more allotted cab rides, after I was sent home, my dad was still scheduled for a week of work. He contacted the local post office and explained his situation. After some evil laughter from both him and the postman, a truck shows up at his hotel. He mails himself to work and then back again for the rest of the week. He pays for first-class delivery by the pound. This becomes exorbitantly expensive. At the end of the trip, my dad sent in an expense report that had a few $1,000s extra on it for shipping costs. The fallout. There was a change in the company. Some people were moved, some people were hired, and some people were fired. My father found himself under a new manager. The company decided that it was improper to have different rules for expenses for different employees based on their status or tenure. A fixed policy was enacted company-wide. My dad's new manager had no issues with sending me out once a month on my father's business account, as long as my father paid for the cost of the flights.